The night began like many others, quiet and uneventful, yet something in the air felt unsettled, as if the house itself was holding its breath, and Laura Bennett sensed it long before the knock came. Sitting alone in the living room of her suburban home in Oregon, the soft glow of a lamp falling over framed family photos that reminded her of the life she had chosen, stable, respectful, predictable, while her husband Mark was away on another business trip, leaving the hours to stretch longer than usual, and Laura tried to distract herself with a book she wasn't really reading, her thoughts drifting to the small cracks she rarely acknowledged, the loneliness that came not from lack of love but from routine, from always being strong, from being the one who kept things together. And just as she stood to turn off the light and head upstairs, a knock echoed through the hallway, slow and unsure, not loud enough to feel urgent but heavy enough to demand attention, and her first thought was confusion because no one ever came that late, especially not unannounced, and when she opened the door to the hallway, she saw Ethan standing there, Mark's son, her stepson, tall and tense, his jacket half-zipped, his eyes tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, and Laura's instinct was concern rather than surprise because she could see immediately that something was wrong, and Ethan spoke quickly as if afraid he might lose his nerve, apologizing for coming so late, saying he didn't know where else to go, and Laura stepped aside without thinking, letting him in, offering him safety before asking questions, because that was who she was, someone who helped first and reflected later, and as Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, rubbing his hands together, Laura noticed how much he had changed over the years, no longer the awkward teenager she first met when she married Mark, but not fully settled into adulthood either, caught somewhere between expectations and fear, and he began talking, not all at once, but in short bursts, explaining that he'd had an argument with his mother, that college felt like a dead end, that he was tired of pretending he was okay when he wasn't, and Laura listened closely, her face calm even as her heart softened, because she recognized that lost feeling, that quiet panic of not knowing where you belong, and she offered him tea, a simple gesture meant to slow the moment down, grounding them both, and as they talked, the night seemed to shrink around them, the ticking clock fading into the background while Ethan admitted things he had never said out loud, fears about failing, about disappointing his father, about feeling invisible in his own life, and Laura responded not as a stepmother with rules or advice but as a human being who understood doubt, telling him that uncertainty did not mean weakness, that taking time did not mean falling behind, and her words landed with weight because they were spoken without judgment, and Ethan looked at her with something close to relief, as if someone had finally spoken his language, and Laura felt a quiet sense of purpose, believing she was doing exactly what she should, offering guidance, reassurance, a place to breathe, unaware that moments like this, when walls come down and trust takes root, can change relationships in subtle but lasting ways, and as the conversation moved forward, touching on memories, shared jokes, small moments from the past that reminded them they were connected by more than circumstance, Laura felt the shift but didn't name it, choosing instead to focus on helping him through the night, convinced that kindness was harmless, that listening carried no risk, and when Ethan finally stood to leave, calmer than when he arrived, thanking her for being there, Laura watched him walk down the hallway with a sense of quiet satisfaction, closing the door behind him and returning to the stillness of the living room, unaware that the knock after midnight was not just a request for help but the beginning of a chain of consequences she could not yet see, consequences that would slowly test her understanding of family, boundaries, and her own heart. In the days after that night, Ethan did not disappear back into his old habits as Laura expected. Instead, he returned with a quiet determination, stopping by the house in the early evenings under simple excuses, sometimes to ask about a job application, sometimes just to sit and talk. And Laura allowed it because nothing felt wrong on the surface, everything stayed respectful, calm, and honest, yet each conversation carried more weight than the last, as Ethan slowly opened up about the pressure he felt growing up between two homes, always trying to be the good son, never feeling fully seen, and Laura listened with patience, understanding that his struggle was not rebellion but confusion, a deep need to belong somewhere without conditions. And she shared parts of her own past, stories of moving away from home, of choosing safety over passion, of learning to be practical when her heart wanted more, and those shared truths created a steady rhythm between them, one built on trust rather than comfort, and as the weeks passed, Laura noticed subtle changes in Ethan, how his voice grew steadier, how his posture straightened, how he started speaking about the future with less fear, and she encouraged him gently, helping him organize his thoughts, suggesting paths rather than answers, reminding him that worth was not measured by speed or success, and Ethan took those words seriously, applying for internships, reaching out to old contacts, and slowly rebuilding confidence he had lost long before that midnight knock. And through it all, Laura believed she was simply being a guide, someone filling the gap where life had failed him, yet she could not ignore the emotional closeness forming beneath their conversations, the way Ethan looked to her for reassurance before making decisions, the way their talks lingered longer than planned, stretching late into the evening. When the house was quiet, and although nothing crossed a line, Laura felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier, aware that emotional support could shape hearts as much as actions, and one evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Ethan confessed his fear of becoming someone he would regret, of waking up one day and realizing he had followed a path chosen by others, and Laura answered with honesty, telling him that fear never fully leaves, that even adults who seem certain often carry doubts they never speak aloud. And in that moment, Ethan saw her not just as a stepmother but as a person who understood uncertainty, and that realization deepened his trust, binding them in a way that felt both meaningful and dangerous. And Laura, though careful with her words and actions, began to sense that her role in his life was becoming central, that her approval mattered more than she intended, and while part of her felt proud of his progress, another part felt uneasy, knowing that emotional dependence can grow quietly, without warning. And when Mark called from his trip, asking casually how things were at home, Laura answered lightly, leaving out the details of Ethan's visits, not out of guilt but out of a desire to protect the fragile balance she felt forming. And as she hung up the phone, she stood alone in the kitchen, realizing that her kindness had reached deeper than planned, shaping not just Ethan's direction but her own emotional landscape. And though she told herself she was helping him stand on his own, she could not deny that their connection had become something that would soon demand clarity, boundaries, and choices she was not yet ready to face. As spring arrived, everything around Laura and Ethan seemed to move faster, and so did the emotions neither of them wanted to name, because Ethan's life was clearly improving. He received interview calls, spoke with confidence, and laughed more easily, but with that growth came a shift in how he interacted with Laura, as if her presence had become a steady anchor he relied on without realizing it. And Laura noticed how he waited for her reactions, how her approval eased his doubts, and how silence between them felt heavier than before, not uncomfortable but charged with meaning. And she tried to slow things down by shortening conversations, by reminding herself of roles and limits, yet emotions are rarely controlled by intention alone, and moments kept slipping through, like shared smiles that lasted a second too long or conversations that drifted from plans to personal reflections. And Laura found herself thinking about Ethan when he wasn't around, wondering if he was eating well, if he was hopeful, if he felt supported, and these thoughts unsettled her because they crossed from care into something deeper, something she refused to define, and the tension grew quietly, never spoken but always present, until one evening Mark called unexpectedly, his voice cheerful as he said his work had wrapped up early and he'd be home in 2 days, and Laura felt a sharp pull in her chest that surprised her, because relief should have been the only feeling, yet anxiety followed close behind. And when she told Ethan about Mark's return, she saw a brief flicker of something pass across his face, disappointment, perhaps, or fear of change, and it made Laura realize how much their routine had become a world of its own, fragile and temporary. And that night she barely slept, turning over thoughts she had avoided, recognizing that emotional closeness without clear boundaries could quietly become a burden, especially when rooted in vulnerability. And the next day she tried to create distance, keeping her words practical, her tone neutral, but Ethan noticed immediately, asking if he had done something wrong, and Laura assured him he hadn't, though the truth was more complicated than blame. And later, alone in the house, Laura reflected on her marriage, on how comfort and stability had slowly replaced excitement, not unhappily but steadily, and she questioned whether her connection with Ethan had awakened parts of herself she had set aside long ago, parts tied to feeling needed, deeply understood, and emotionally alive. And that realization frightened her because it placed responsibility squarely on her shoulders, reminding her that even unspoken emotions can have consequences. And when Mark finally arrived home, filling the house with familiar sounds and routines, Laura welcomed him warmly, determined to restore balance, yet she sensed that something invisible had already shifted, that the quiet bond formed in shared vulnerability could not simply be undone, and as Ethan kept his distance over the next few days, respectful but reserved, Laura understood that the closeness they had shared now demanded resolution, not denial, and that whatever came next would require honesty, restraint, and the courage to accept that helping someone can sometimes reveal truths about oneself that are far harder to face. In the weeks that followed Mark's return, the house settled back into its old rhythm, yet beneath the routine Laura felt a quiet tension that never fully faded, because Ethan had changed his behavior in a way that showed growth but also distance, speaking less, visiting rarely, focusing on interviews and plans beyond the house, and Laura understood this was necessary, even healthy, though it left her with a mix of relief and sadness she kept to herself. And one evening Ethan asked to speak with her before dinner, his voice steady but serious as he shared that he had accepted a job offer in another state, an opportunity that felt right, something that would allow him to start fresh without the weight of old expectations, and Laura listened closely, proud of him, knowing her encouragement had helped him reach this point, yet also aware that his decision was a quiet act of separation, a way to step out of a space that had grown emotionally complex, and she congratulated him sincerely, offering practical advice and calm support, keeping her tone warm but measured, and as his moving date approached, their conversation stayed respectful and brief, centered on logistics rather than feelings, though both sensed the unspoken significance of what they were leaving behind, and on the night before Ethan left, they shared a final conversation in the living room, simple and honest, where Ethan thanked her not for solving his problems but for listening when he felt lost, for treating him like someone capable of finding his own way, and Laura responded by reminding him that strength often comes from facing uncertainty rather than avoiding it, and when he hugged her goodbye, it was brief and appropriate, yet full of gratitude, and after he walked out the door, Laura stood alone in the quiet house, reflecting on how one night of kindness had led to growth, distance, and self-awareness for them both, and as time passed, life continued forward. Mark remained unaware of the emotional weight Laura carried, and she chose not to disturb the stability they shared, accepting that some experiences are meant to be lessons rather than confessions, and in the quiet moments, Laura learned to forgive herself for feelings she had not chosen, to respect boundaries she now understood more clearly, and to recognize that helping someone can change both lives in unexpected ways, leaving behind not regret but understanding. And though the memory of that night after midnight stayed with her, it no longer felt heavy, only meaningful, a reminder that compassion has power, and that maturity sometimes means letting go with grace, even when the heart takes longer to catch up.